In 1989, a Soviet fleet left port. 17 submarines, plus a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer, enough firepower to intimidate smaller countries. But it wasn't going to war, and it wasn't flying the Soviet naval flag. For a brief moment, this fleet belonged to a corporation in Purchase, New York. Pepsi. Yes, the soda company. And the reason wasn't comedy, it was collapse. Because when a superpower destroys its own money, it has to pay in something else. So the Soviet Union did something unthinkable. It tried to settle a soda deal with warships. And if you follow that transaction to the end, you don't just find a strange headline. You find a snapshot of an empire running out of options. The story of how a soda company ended up owning Soviet warships is not a joke. It is a story of desperation, and of a nuclear-armed state whose financial system had weakened so badly that even ordinary commerce became a problem. To understand how this happened, we need to go back 30 years to a hot summer day in Moscow. The year was 1959. That summer, the United States hosted the American National Exhibition in Moscow. It was meant to ease tensions between two rivals, a cultural exchange. But the exhibit itself was something else entirely, a showroom of consumer capitalism. Color televisions, modern kitchens, dishwashers, cars. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, walked through the display and grew increasingly irritated. To him, it looked like propaganda, a deliberate attempt to make Soviet workers feel deprived. Standing inside a model American kitchen, Khrushchev got into a heated, unscripted argument with U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon. The exchange became famous. History would remember it as the kitchen debate. Nearby, watching that scene unfold, stood a man named Donald Kendall. Kendall ran Pepsi's international division, and he had built his career around one bold idea: getting Pepsi into the Soviet Union. He understood something simple. If he could put the product directly into Khrushchev's hands, it would be the kind of marketing moment money couldn't buy. So he took a risk. He poured an ice-cold Pepsi into a paper cup and stepped forward. Without permission, he moved between the Vice President of the United States and the leader of the Soviet Union and handed Khrushchev the drink. Khrushchev was hot, flustered, and angry. He took a sip. The carbonation hit first, then the sugar, and something unexpected happened. He smiled. He finished the cup and turned to the press. "It's very refreshing," he said. The image traveled around the world. Donald Kendall had won the moment. But a photograph is not a business deal. The real work took another 13 years, and the biggest obstacle wasn't ideology. The Soviets wanted the soda. They wanted proof that communism could provide the same small comforts as the West. The obstacle was money, or more precisely, the lack of usable money. The Soviet ruble was a soft currency. Outside the Soviet Union, it was effectively worthless. No bank in London or New York wanted rubles, and the official exchange rate set by Moscow was largely fiction. Pepsi needed dollars. Hard currency. Money they could use to buy inputs, pay shareholders, and record real profits. The Soviets did not have dollars to spare, so both sides were stuck. The Soviets wanted Pepsi. Pepsi wanted payment. Neither side could move. In 1972, they found a workaround. Barter. Pepsi agreed to build bottling plants inside the USSR and supply the syrup concentrate. In return, the Soviet government gave Pepsi exclusive rights to import and sell Stolichnaya vodka in the United States. Liquid for liquid. American soda for Russian vodka. For a time, it worked. Pepsi became the first Western consumer product widely sold behind the Iron Curtain. And for Soviet citizens, surrounded by shortages and gray uniformity, the Bright felt like something else entirely, the small taste of another world. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was consuming nearly 1 billion servings of Pepsi per year. But the balance was breaking. The Soviet appetite for Pepsi grew far faster than American demand for vodka. Pepsi shipped enormous volumes of syrup east, but vodka sales in the US didn't keep up. Inside the USSR, Pepsi began accumulating piles of rubles it could not use, money trapped inside a system that couldn't convert it into anything meaningful. By the late 1980s, the contract was expiring, and Donald Kendall, now CEO of PepsiCo, returned to Moscow to renegotiate. What he found was alarming. The Soviet economy was unraveling. Years of stagnation were catching up, and the leadership knew one thing for certain. If Pepsi disappeared, unrest would follow. It had become one of the last visible comforts left. When Kendall asked how they planned to close the financial gap, the answer was silence. No dollars. No additional vodka. No solution. Until someone looked at what the Soviet Union still had in abundance. Weapons. In a quiet meeting room, a Soviet official slid a paper across the table. It was not a check. It was a list. Warships, submarines, military hardware. The proposal was simple and insane. They could not pay for Pepsi with money, so they would pay with the Navy. The ships were old, obsolete, and rusting. They weren't meant to be used. They were meant to be sold, scrapped, and turned into metal. Pepsi accepted. And for a brief legal moment, PepsiCo technically owned one of the largest submarine fleets in the world. The ships were transferred to Norwegian scrapyards. They were cut apart, melted down, and recycled, a quiet end for vessels built to fight a global war. The deal itself was worth nearly $3 billion, and to make the numbers work, the Soviets promised more. New oil tankers, built in Soviet shipyards. Pepsi would own them, lease them, and earn hard currency. At that point, Pepsi had become something unexpected. A soda company acting as banker, ship owner, and commodities trader, all to sell a drink that cost pennies to produce. Washington was uneasy. During arms control talks, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft questioned the deal. Donald Kendall replied calmly, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." It sounded clever, but the truth was darker. A superpower does not sell its navy unless it is desperate. By 1989, the Soviet economy was collapsing. Oil revenues fell. Inflation surged. Supply chains broke. Stores emptied. People waited in line for bread. And yet, Pepsi kiosks stayed open. Pepsi had become more than a drink. It was a symbol, not of ideology, but of normal life. Then history accelerated. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Borders appeared overnight. Contracts vanished. Shipyards ended up in new countries. Assets were seized. The oil tankers never arrived. Vodka trademarks dissolved into chaos. Pepsi was left holding agreements signed by a state that no longer existed. Coca-Cola entered with cash. No barter. No legacy baggage. They built new plants, ran ads, and took the momentum. Pepsi fell behind. The fleet was gone. The advantage vanished. The final image came years later. Mikhail Gorbachev appeared in a Pizza Hut commercial, the former leader of a superpower. Selling fast food, not a satire, but necessity. The Pepsi Navy story is not about soda. It is about money and what happens when a system forgets what money really is. Weapons cannot replace value. Power cannot substitute trust. And when an economy collapses, even submarines become scrap. Empires fall quietly, not to bombs, but to empty shelves. And that's the moment the ledger outvotes the ideology. Chrono Finance, following the money through time.